Richard Sterling's champagne glass slipped from his manicured fingers, crystal shattering against marble as he watched the homeless veteran cradle what he'd intended as the cruelest joke of his privileged life. The crowd at Austin's premier dog show fell silent, 200 gasps creating a vacuum of disbelief around the makeshift stage where moments before, Richard had smugly handed over the most worthless animal in Texas to a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. But David Thompson wasn't worthless, and neither was Ranger. Margaret Whitman pressed her weathered face against her apartment window 3 blocks away, her nurse's instincts screaming as she watched the German Shepherd's protective stance over the frail veteran. The dog's ears weren't flattened in submission. They were alert, scanning for threats with military precision. Something was terribly wrong or terrifyingly right. "Get that animal away from here!" someone shouted from the crowd. What Richard Sterling didn't know was that this single act of calculated cruelty would save 3 lives and destroy everything he thought he understood about power, loyalty, and the price of redemption. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that fateful Saturday afternoon, David Thompson had been a different man entirely. At 58, he'd commanded respect as Austin High School's beloved principal, a decorated Army captain who'd earned 3 Bronze Stars across multiple deployments in Afghanistan. Students called him Captain Dave, and parents trusted him with their most precious gifts. His corner office overlooked the football field where he'd watch Friday night games with Sarah, his wife of 26 years, their daughter Emma cheering from the sidelines in her senior year. The cancer took Sarah first, pancreatic, aggressive, merciless. David held her hand through 18 months of treatments, watching the woman who'd waited through 3 combat tours fade into a hospital bed. "Take care of our girl," were Sarah's last coherent words. 3 months later, Emma's Toyota Camry hydroplaned on Mopac during a spring thunderstorm. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. David remembered the exact time because he'd been staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep in their too-empty house. The grief didn't arrive like a storm. It came like a slow drowning. David tried returning to work, but the hallways echoed with Emma's laughter from her visits, and every parent conference reminded him of conversations he'd never have again. The nightmares from Afghanistan, dormant for years, returned with compound interest. Sounds became triggers, car backfires, slamming doors, even the school's morning announcements. When he snapped at a 10-year-old for dropping books too loudly, David knew he was broken beyond repair. The foreclosure notice came 6 months after Emma's funeral. Medical bills, funeral expenses, and missed work had drained everything. David packed his few remaining possessions into a worn duffel bag, the same one he'd carried through Kandahar, and walked away from the life he'd built. The bridge underpass on I-35 became home, a concrete cave that reminded him of the forward operating bases where he'd once felt useful, necessary, alive. Now he survived on day labor, disability checks that barely covered food, and the kindness of strangers who saw him as human rather than scenery. Most people looked through him, their eyes sliding past his weathered face and faded army jacket as if he were already a ghost. The diagnosis came 2 weeks ago during a free clinic visit, stage 3 pancreatic cancer, the same disease that had claimed Sarah. No insurance meant no treatment, just a polite suggestion to get his affairs in order. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling lived 40 stories above the city in a penthouse that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. His tech empire, Sterling Dynamics, had made him worth $2.3 billion before his 45th birthday. The irony wasn't lost on him that while David had spent years protecting people, Richard had spent years protecting only his own interests. But success hadn't filled the void left by a childhood spent watching his Vietnam veteran father, Robert, disappear into bottles of whiskey and rage. When Robert finally put a gun to his head, Richard had felt relief, a reaction that still haunted his therapy sessions. The Austin Dog Show had always been Richard Sterling's least favorite charity obligation, but Sterling Dynamics Board insisted on maintaining their community presence. The September afternoon buzzed with the nervous energy of handlers prepping their animals, while families spread picnic blankets across Zilker Park's freshly cut grass. Local news crews positioned themselves strategically, hoping to capture heartwarming footage for the evening broadcast. Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie and surveyed the scene with barely concealed disdain. Children squealed as golden retrievers performed tricks, elderly couples cooed over pampered poodles, and somewhere a brass band played patriotic marches off-key. The whole spectacle struck him as grotesquely sentimental. Americans and their obsession with animals, as if loving a dog could somehow compensate for their own moral failures. "Mr. Sterling," chirped Amanda Walsh from the organizing committee, her smile bright enough to power the sound system. "We're so grateful for Sterling Dynamics' sponsorship. Are you ready to present the Best in Show trophy?" Before Richard could respond, commotion erupted near the demonstration ring. A massive German shepherd had broken free from his handler, barreling toward a group of children gathered around a popcorn stand. Screams pierced the afternoon air as parents grabbed their kids, the crowd scattering like startled birds. The dog's handler, a nervous young man in a dog trainer's vest, stumbled after his charge while shouting commands that went unheeded. But Richard saw what others missed in their panic. The shepherd wasn't attacking. He was intercepting. A poorly secured equipment rack was toppling toward a little girl in pigtails, 20 pounds of metal and wood that would have crushed her small frame. The dog's powerful shoulders hit the falling structure, deflecting it harmlessly into empty grass, while the child's mother yanked her daughter to safety. The crowd's terror transformed into confused murmuring, then grudging appreciation. But the damage was done. Animal control officers were already approaching, hands resting on tranquilizer guns. The handler's face had gone pale as he clipped a heavy chain leash to the dog's collar. "Ranger, down," the handler commanded, his voice shaking. The shepherd obeyed immediately, dropping into a perfect military sit despite the chaos around him. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He's never done anything like this before." Richard studied the animal with growing interest. This wasn't just any dog. The bearing, the discipline, the protective instincts spoke of military training. A war dog, probably retired from service, and clearly one with behavioral issues that made him unsuitable for civilian life. "What happens to him now?" Richard asked the lead animal control officer. The man shrugged. "Probably euthanization. Can't have aggressive animals around families, even if his intentions were good. Too much liability." Through the fence separating the dog show from the adjacent park, Richard noticed movement. A homeless man was picking through a trash can, collecting aluminum cans in a battered grocery cart. The man's clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, but something about his posture, straight-backed despite his circumstances, caught Richard's attention. When the man turned, Richard saw the faded patches on his Army surplus jacket. 101st Airborne, Afghanistan, deployment ribbons. A veteran. How perfect. Richard's mind began calculating. The same cold precision that had built his empire now focused on a different kind of acquisition. The crowd was dispersing, embarrassed by their overreaction, eager to return to the sanitized entertainment of groomed show dogs. The handler was pleading with animal control for more time, promising better restraints, more training. "Officer," Richard called out, his voice carrying the authority that $2 billion could buy. What if someone were willing to take responsibility for the animal? The animal control officer looked skeptical. Sir, this dog has demonstrated aggressive tendencies. We can't just— I'll sign whatever liability waivers you need. Richard pulled out his phone, speed dialing his legal team. Get me a standard animal ownership transfer agreement. Yes, now. 20 minutes later, Richard held the papers that made him Ranger's legal owner. The crowd had reassembled, drawn by the spectacle of Austin's most famous billionaire involved in the drama. News cameras focused on him as he approached the fence where the homeless veteran continued his methodical search for recyclables. "Excuse me," Richard called out, his voice projecting enough to reach the gathered onlookers. "Sir?" The veteran looked up, wariness flickering across weathered features. Up close, Richard could see the man's hands shaking slightly, whether from hunger, illness, or something else he couldn't tell. "I have a proposition for you," Richard announced, loud enough for the cameras to catch every word. "This dog needs a home, and you look like you could use a companion." He gestured toward Ranger, who watched the exchange with intelligent dark eyes. "Consider him a gift," the crowd murmured, some impressed by the apparent generosity. Richard savored their approval, even as his true motivation remained hidden. What better way to dispose of a problematic animal than to give it to someone who clearly couldn't handle the responsibility? David Thompson stared at the German shepherd sitting obediently at his feet, the weight of 100 curious gazes pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. The dog's dark eyes held an intelligence that reminded him of the military working dogs he'd served alongside in Afghanistan, loyal, disciplined, but carrying invisible wounds that only another soldier could recognize. "I appreciate the gesture, sir," David said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "But I can't afford to feed myself, let alone a dog this size." Richard's smile never wavered, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Oh, but I insist. Consider it my contribution to veteran affairs." The way he said it made the word sound like a diagnosis rather than gratitude. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? The crowd chuckled at what they assumed was self-deprecating humor, but David heard the underlying malice. This wasn't generosity. It was a punishment disguised as charity, designed to entertain these well-dressed spectators who saw him as less than human. He'd encountered this before. The peculiar cruelty of people who gave homeless individuals impossible gifts, then delighted in watching them struggle. But as David looked down at Ranger, something shifted in his chest. The dog's ears were flattened slightly, his body language screaming distress despite his obedient posture. This animal was as lost and discarded as David himself, thrust into an impossible situation by someone who clearly viewed both of them as disposable. "Come on, boy," David murmured, accepting the leash from Richard's manicured hands. The transfer felt ceremonial, almost biblical. One broken thing passed to another. "Looks like we're in this together." 3 blocks away, Margaret Whitman pressed her face closer to her apartment window, her arthritic fingers gripping the sill. From her third-floor perch, she had a clear view of the park where the commotion was unfolding. Through her late husband Harold's binoculars, the ones he'd used for bird-watching before the stroke took him, she watched the exchange with growing unease. Margaret had been observing the homeless veteran for weeks now, ever since he'd started sleeping under the I-35 overpass visible from her kitchen window. At 72, she'd developed the heightened awareness that comes with living alone, cataloging the rhythms of her neighborhood like a security guard on eternal duty. The man intrigued her because he didn't fit the stereotype that most people held about homeless individuals. He kept himself as clean as circumstances allowed, never bothered anyone, and carried himself with a dignity that spoke of better days. But it was more than that. Something about his bearing reminded her of her son Michael, the Marine who died in Helmand Province 11 years ago. Michael had that same way of scanning his surroundings, that unconscious military alertness that never quite faded even on leave. When Margaret learned the homeless man was a veteran, she'd seen him at the VA clinic downtown during one of her own appointments, the resemblance became almost painful. Now, watching this public spectacle unfold, Margaret felt her nurse's instincts screaming warnings. She'd worked emergency rooms for 43 years before retirement, and she knew predatory behavior when she saw it. The billionaire's body language, the way he positioned himself for the cameras, the theatrical nature of the gift, none of it rang true. That evening, David led Ranger through the maze of shopping carts and cardboard shelters that comprised Austin's invisible city beneath the interstate. The dog walked beside him with military precision, neither pulling ahead nor lagging behind, his attention constantly shifting between David and their surroundings. Other homeless individuals gave them a wide berth. A German shepherd that size represented either protection or danger, and most weren't willing to risk finding out which. David's makeshift camp consisted of a blue tarp stretched between concrete support pillars, with cardboard laid down to insulate against the cold concrete. It wasn't much, but it was dry and relatively hidden from casual observers. He'd chosen this spot carefully, close enough to the city for odd jobs and food, far enough from foot traffic to avoid harassment. Ranger explored the small space methodically, his nose working overtime to catalog the scents and sounds of his new environment. David watched him with professional interest, recognizing the behavior patterns of a military working dog conducting a security sweep. "You served, didn't you, boy?" David said softly, settling onto his sleeping bag. "I can see it in the way you move, professional." Disciplined. He studied the dog's scars, faded marks on his hindquarters that looked like shrapnel wounds, a slight favor to his left rear paw that suggested old trauma. "What did they do to you over there?" As if responding to the question, Ranger suddenly tensed, his head snapping toward the overpass above them. A semi-truck was downshifting as it navigated the curved ramp, its air brakes releasing with a sharp hiss that sounded exactly like incoming mortar rounds. The dog's entire body went rigid, pupils dilating as he pressed himself against the concrete wall. David's own heart rate spiked at the familiar sound, but years of managing his PTSD had taught him coping mechanisms. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice steady despite his own triggered memories. "Just a truck. We're not there anymore. We're safe." But Ranger was lost in whatever hellscape his mind had conjured. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not aggressive, but desperate. And David recognized the signs immediately because he'd lived them himself during the worst days after his return from deployment. Without thinking, David reached out slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "It's okay, soldier," he murmured, using the same tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses on his grandfather's farm decades ago. "I know where you are right now, but you're not there. You're here with me." His fingers made contact with Ranger's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the coarse fur. The dog flinched but didn't pull away, and gradually, very gradually, his breathing began to slow. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, two veterans sharing the weight of memories too heavy to carry alone. When Margaret arrived the next morning with a bag of dog food and a thermos of coffee, she found them sleeping side by side, David's hand still resting protectively on Ranger's flank. The first week under the bridge tested both David and Ranger in ways neither had anticipated. David's disability check wouldn't arrive for another 3 weeks, and his meager savings from collecting cans barely covered his own food, let alone a 70-pound German shepherd's appetite. He found himself splitting his daily meal, usually a gas station sandwich or whatever the food bank offered, watching Ranger Wolf down his portion with the desperate efficiency of an animal who'd learned not to expect regular meals. Margaret Whitman became their unlikely guardian angel, though she maintained the pretense of casual encounters. "Just happened to buy too much dog food," she'd say, appearing at the overpass entrance with a bag of kibble and bottled water. "Seems wasteful to throw it away." David wasn't fooled by her excuses, but pride and gratitude warred in his chest every time she appeared. On Thursday morning, a security camera at the nearby gas station captured footage that would change everything. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in Margaret's building, was withdrawing money from the ATM when a man in a hoodie approached from behind. The would-be robber was closing in when Ranger, who'd been lying peacefully beside David at the nearby bus stop, suddenly bolted upright. The dog's protective instincts, honed by years of military service, kicked in with startling precision. Ranger positioned himself between Mrs. Chen and her attacker, his body language shifting from relaxed companion to formidable guardian. He didn't attack. His training was too sophisticated for mindless aggression, but his mere presence, combined with a low growl that seemed to rumble from the earth itself, sent the would-be thief scrambling down the street. Mrs. Chen, shaken but unharmed, looked down at the dog with wonder before hurrying into the store to call police. The security footage, shared by the grateful store owner, went viral within hours. Ranger. The hero began trending on social media, transforming the narrative from "dangerous dog dumped on homeless veteran" to "hero dog saves elderly woman." Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly David found himself fielding interview requests from reporters who weeks earlier wouldn't have acknowledged his existence. But the attention brought unexpected complications. Animal control, prompted by citizen complaints about an aggressive dog living under the bridge, arrived on Friday afternoon with badges and clipboards. Officer Martinez, a middle-aged Latina with kind eyes and an unfortunate mandate, approached David's camp with visible reluctance. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your dog's vaccination records and proof of registration," she said, her tone apologetic but firm. "We've received multiple complaints about an unlicensed animal in the area." David's heart sank. "Ma'am, I just got this dog a week ago. I haven't had the money for vet bills yet." "I understand your situation," Officer Martinez replied, genuine sympathy in her voice. "But the law is clear. Without proper documentation, I have to impound the animal. You'll have 72 hours to provide the required paperwork and pay the associated fees, or—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. As she approached with the catch pole, Ranger moved protectively in front of David, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable posture of a soldier defending his commanding officer. The sight broke something in David's chest. This dog, abandoned and traumatized, still possessed the instinct to protect others, even when facing his own destruction. Margaret appeared as if summoned by crisis, her nurse's bag slung over her shoulder and determination etched on her weathered features. "Officer, there's been a mistake," she announced with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in emergencies. "This dog is registered under my name. I'm fostering him through the local rescue organization." Officer Martinez looked confused. "Ma'am, do you have documentation to support that claim?" "Of course." Margaret pulled out her cell phone with the confidence of someone who'd clearly prepared for this moment. "I'm calling Dr. Sarah Kim at Four Paws Veterinary Clinic right now. She has all of Ranger's medical records on file." What followed was either the most elaborate impromptu deception David had ever witnessed or a miracle of bureaucratic coordination. Within 30 minutes, Dr. Kim arrived with a manila folder containing vaccination records, registration papers, and a foster agreement that appeared to have been notarized. Officer Martinez examined the documents with professional skepticism, but couldn't find any obvious irregularities. "Everything appears to be in order," she finally admitted, though her expression suggested she suspected something was amiss. But understand, ma'am, if there are any further incidents or complaints, we'll be conducting a much more thorough investigation." After Officer Martinez left, David stared at Margaret with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "How did you—" "Dr. Kim is my neighbor," Margaret interrupted with a slight smile. "She's been treating veterans' service animals pro bono for years. When I explained Ranger's situation, she was happy to help. The paperwork is all legitimate. I really am fostering him, at least on paper." That evening, as David and Ranger settled into their routine under the bridge, he noticed something different about the dog's behavior. Ranger had begun exhibiting a peculiar fixation with David's right side, repeatedly sniffing and pawing at his abdomen with increasing urgency. Initially, David attributed it to the lingering scent of food or perhaps some sort of territorial marking behavior, but the behavior intensified over the following days. Ranger would wake David in the middle of the night, pressing his nose insistently against David's stomach, whining with an urgency that seemed to communicate something vital. Margaret, observing during one of her morning visits, felt her medical training kick into high gear. "How long has he been doing that?" she asked, watching Ranger's focused attention on David's midsection. "About a week," David replied, gently pushing the dog away. "He's just being protective, I think. Maybe he smells something he doesn't like." Margaret's expression grew serious. "David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. When was your last medical checkup?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David had been dreading this conversation, hoping his symptoms would remain his secret burden. The weight loss, the persistent pain in his abdomen, the fatigue that no amount of sleep could alleviate, he'd been ignoring them all, partly from denial and partly from the practical reality that medical care was a luxury he couldn't afford. 2 weeks ago," he admitted quietly. "Free clinic downtown." "And what did they tell you?" David closed his eyes, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. They said—" He swallowed hard. "They said I should get my affairs in order." Margaret's medical mask slipped, revealing the raw pain of someone who'd lost too many people to similar diagnoses. "David, oh my God. Why didn't you tell me?" What was I supposed to say? "Thanks for the dog food, by the way. I'm dying?" The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "Besides, it doesn't matter. No insurance, no money, no treatment options. At least this way, when I'm gone, maybe Ranger will have someone who cares about him." But Margaret was already reaching for her phone, her mind shifting into the crisis management mode that had served her through decades of emergency room chaos. "Dr. Kim, it's Margaret. I need you to call Dr. Rodriguez at Austin Cancer Center. We have a situation." Meanwhile, across town in his sterile penthouse office, Richard Sterling was experiencing his own form of discomfort. The viral video of Ranger's heroic act had generated thousands of comments, many of them questioning the wisdom of giving such an obviously well-trained dog to a homeless person as some sort of joke. Social media investigators had dug up the original footage from the dog show, and the narrative was shifting in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. His private investigators' daily reports had become increasingly uncomfortable reading. David Thompson wasn't the drug-addicted vagrant Richard had assumed. He was a decorated veteran struggling with PTSD and grief. The dog wasn't vicious or uncontrollable. He was a former military working dog dealing with his own trauma. And worst of all, the bond between man and animal was genuine, deep, and apparently healing for both of them. Richard found himself scrolling through social media comments during board meetings, reading testimonials from people who'd been inspired by David and Ranger's story. Veterans shared their own struggles with PTSD and homelessness. Dog lovers praised Ranger's protective instincts and obvious intelligence. And increasingly, People were asking uncomfortable questions about Richard's motives. The turning point came when Richard's own daughter, Jessica, called from her freshman dorm at Stanford. They'd barely spoken since his divorce from her mother 3 years earlier, their relationship another casualty of his obsession with control and success. "Dad, I saw the video of you giving that dog to the homeless man," Jessica said without preamble. "Please tell me you were actually trying to help him and not just being cruel for your own entertainment." The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than any boardroom criticism or media scrutiny. Richard had spent years justifying his behavior as necessary hardness, the price of success in a competitive world. But hearing his own daughter question his basic decency forced him to confront truths he'd been avoiding. "It's complicated, Jess," he said finally. "No, Dad, it's really not. Either you were helping someone who needed it, or you were using your money and privilege to humiliate someone who was already suffering. Which one was it?" Richard couldn't answer, because they both knew the truth. And for the first time in years, Richard Sterling felt something he'd almost forgotten how to experience: shame. The crisis erupted on a Tuesday morning when David collapsed during his usual walk to the food bank. Ranger had been increasingly agitated for days, circling David restlessly and refusing to eat. The dog's behavior had escalated from concerned sniffing to desperate pawing, as if trying to communicate something urgent that humans were too obtuse to understand. Margaret was watering her plants on the third-floor balcony when she heard Ranger's frantic barking echoing from the street below. Through Harold's binoculars, she watched in horror as David crumpled to the sidewalk outside the grocery store, his body convulsing in what looked like a seizure. Ranger positioned himself protectively over David's prone form, his barks becoming increasingly desperate as concerned shoppers began to gather. By the time the ambulance arrived, a crowd of nearly 50 people had formed a respectful circle around the fallen veteran and his guardian. Ranger refused to let the paramedics approach initially, his military training interpreting their rapid movements and medical equipment as potential threats. It took Margaret's arrival and her calm, authoritative voice to convince the dog to allow the EMTs to work. "He's having complications from pancreatic cancer," Margaret explained to the lead paramedic as they loaded David onto the stretcher. "Stage 3, diagnosed 2 weeks ago. No insurance, no treatment plan." The paramedic's expression grew grim. "Memorial Hospital has a charity care program, but for something this advanced—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. They would stabilize David, run tests they knew he couldn't pay for, then discharge him to die with whatever pain management they could legally provide. At Memorial Hospital's emergency department, Dr. Elena Rodriguez reviewed David's case file with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many similar situations. The CT scans confirmed what everyone already knew. The cancer had progressed aggressively, metastasizing to his liver and lymph nodes. Without immediate surgery and an aggressive treatment protocol, David had perhaps 6 weeks to live. "The good news is that he's responded well to the IV fluids and pain medication," Dr. Rodriguez explained to Margaret in the hallway outside David's room. "But I'll be honest with you, the surgery he needs would cost upward of $200,000. Our charity care fund might cover 20% of that, but the rest—" "What if someone else paid for it?" Margaret asked. "Hypothetically." Dr. Rodriguez looked surprised. "Well, hypothetically, he'd be an excellent candidate for surgery. He's still relatively young, in good physical condition aside from the cancer, and the tumor appears to be resectable. But Mrs. Whitman, we're talking about $250,000. That's not the kind of money that just appears." In the room beyond the glass partition, David lay connected to monitors and IV lines, looking smaller and more fragile than Margaret had ever seen him. Ranger sat beside the bed in perfect military attention, having somehow convinced the hospital security guards that he was a registered service animal. The dog's vigil was absolute. He hadn't moved from David's side except to accept water from the nursing staff. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never expected to use. Richard Sterling's personal assistant answered on the second ring with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to filtering the unimportant from the urgent. "Sterling Dynamics, this is Amanda. How may I help you?" "I need to speak with Mr. Sterling immediately," Margaret said, her voice carrying 40 years of emergency room authority. "Tell him it's about the dog he gave away. Tell him it's literally a matter of life and death." Meanwhile, Richard was in the middle of a board meeting when Amanda's urgent knock interrupted his presentation about quarterly projections. The message she handed him was brief but effective. "Emergency call about the veteran and the dog. Says it's life or death. Line 2. Richard excused himself from the meeting, his stomach knotting with an unfamiliar sensation, guilt mixed with genuine concern. In his private office, he picked up the phone to hear a woman's voice, strong despite her obvious emotional strain. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Margaret Whitman. I'm the neighbor who's been helping David Thompson, the veteran you gave Ranger to. David is dying, and that dog is the only reason he's still alive." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't understand. What do you mean, dying?" Margaret's explanation was methodical and devastating. David's cancer diagnosis, his lack of insurance, the dog's apparent ability to detect the progression of the disease, and now the urgent need for surgery that would cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. "The doctors say he has 6 weeks without treatment," Margaret concluded. "But with surgery and chemotherapy he could have years, good years. And that dog, the one you gave him, is some kind of joke. That dog has been trying to save his life from the moment they met." Richard felt the careful architecture of his self-justification crumbling. "Mrs. Whitman, I had no idea about his medical condition." "Of course you didn't," Margaret replied, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "Because you didn't bother to see him as a human being. You saw a homeless veteran and decided he'd make good entertainment for your friends. Well, congratulations, Mr. Sterling. Your entertainment is about to kill a genuinely good man." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Richard found himself thinking about his father, Robert, and the years of neglect and contempt that had driven him to suicide. How many times had Richard dismissed his father's struggles as weakness, his drinking as moral failure rather than self-medication for invisible wounds? "What do you want me to do?" Richard asked quietly. "I want you to be the man your money should have made you," Margaret replied. "I want you to save the life you put in danger with your cruelty. And I want you to understand that sometimes the people we throw away are worth more than everything we think we've accomplished." After ending the call, Richard sat in his leather chair, staring out at the Austin skyline. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the highway where David and Ranger had built their unlikely partnership. The irony wasn't lost on him. He lived above the clouds while the man he'd tried to humiliate had been slowly dying in the shadows below. His intercom buzzed. "Sir, your daughter is on line 1, says it's important." Jessica's voice carried the determined tone she'd inherited from her mother. "Dad, I'm driving down from campus. I saw the news about the veteran in the hospital. Please tell me you're going to help him." "Jess, it's complicated." "No, it's not," she interrupted, using the same phrase she'd wielded in their previous conversation. "You have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. This man is dying because he can't afford medical care. You have the power to change that. The only question is whether you're going to choose to be generous or selfish." Through his office window, Richard could see Memorial Hospital's tower in the distance. Somewhere in that building, a veteran was dying while his dog maintained a loyal vigil. The same veteran Richard had tried to humiliate was now offering him something he'd never expected, the chance at redemption. "Dad?" Jessica's voice brought him back to the conversation. "Are you there?" "I'm here," Richard said, reaching for his phone to call his personal attorney. "And I'm going to make this right." At the hospital, David drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain medication creating a hazy buffer between awareness and sleep. During his lucid moments, he was acutely aware of Ranger's presence, the weight of the dog's head resting against his arm, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional soft whine when medical staff moved too quickly around the bed. In his more coherent moments, David found himself composing a mental letter to his deceased wife and daughter. He wanted to tell them about the dog, about Margaret's unexpected kindness, about finding purpose again in caring for another damaged soul. He wanted them to know that even in his darkest hour, he'd discovered that love, given and received, could still transform suffering into something bearable. What David didn't know was that 3 floors above him, Richard Sterling was signing papers that would not only save his life, but fundamentally alter the trajectory of 3 families forever. The pen felt heavier than usual in Richard's hand, weighted with the knowledge that this decision would cost him money he'd never miss, but might gain him something infinitely more valuable: the respect of his daughter and perhaps some measure of peace with his own conscience. The waiting room at Memorial Hospital felt like a purgatory of fluorescent lighting and disinfectant smells. Margaret sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her weathered hands clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Ranger lay at her feet, his massive head resting on his paws, dark eyes fixed on the surgical wing doors as if he could will David back to consciousness through sheer determination. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the operating room at 3:47 a.m., her surgical scrubs stained with the evidence of a 12-hour battle. Margaret's heart clenched at the exhaustion etched on the surgeon's face. In her decades of nursing, she'd seen that expression too many times, and it rarely preceded good news. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," Dr. Rodriguez said, settling into the chair beside Margaret. "We were able to remove the primary tumor and clear the affected lymph nodes. But I need you to understand, the cancer had spread more extensively than our initial scans indicated. We found metastases in his liver that weren't visible on the CT." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "What does that mean for his prognosis?" "It means the fight isn't over. We'll need to begin an aggressive chemotherapy protocol immediately, assuming he survives the next 48 hours. The surgery was extensive, and his body was already weakened by months of malnutrition and stress." Dr. Rodriguez paused, choosing her words carefully. "Even with treatment, we're looking at a 50-50 chance of 5-year survival. Without it, he has perhaps 2 months. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of distress in Margaret's voice, his ears pricking forward with alert concern. The dog had refused to leave the hospital despite multiple attempts by security to remove him. Each time someone approached with a leash or carrier, Ranger would simply move closer to Margaret, as if claiming her protection while maintaining his vigil for David. "There's something else," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "The anonymous donor who's covering Mr. Thompson's medical expenses, they've also arranged for him to be transferred to MD Anderson in Houston if our treatment protocol doesn't show immediate results. That's a level of care that most insured patients can't access. Someone very wealthy is taking a personal interest in his case." Margaret nodded, though she felt no gratitude toward Richard Sterling. His money was welcome, necessary even, but it couldn't erase the cruelty that had preceded this 11th-hour generosity. David was fighting for his life because he'd been too proud to burden others with his diagnosis and too poor to seek treatment when it might have made a real difference. The next morning brought Jessica Sterling to the hospital, her Stanford University sweatshirt wrinkled from the overnight drive from campus. She found Margaret in the cafeteria, mechanically eating a sandwich while Ranger dozed at her feet. The young woman approached tentatively, clearly uncertain of her welcome. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm Jessica Sterling, Richard Sterling's daughter." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I wanted to apologize for my father's behavior. What he did was unconscionable." Margaret studied the girl, barely 20, with her father's sharp features but eyes that held genuine warmth and remorse. Your father's actions don't reflect on you, dear. You didn't choose them. But I didn't stop them either, Jessica replied, sinking into the chair across from Margaret. I knew he had issues with veterans because of my grandfather, but I never thought he'd act so cruelly. When I saw that video of him giving Ranger to Mr. Thompson, I knew immediately what he was doing. Your grandfather was a veteran? Jessica nodded, her expression growing distant. Robert Sterling, Vietnam War. He came back, broken, I guess. Drinking, anger, violence. My dad was just a kid when it got really bad. Grandpa Robert killed himself when my father was 15. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Dad never got over it. But instead of understanding that veterans need help, he decided they were all weak, dangerous, failures. It's like he blamed every veteran for what his father became. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Richard's cruelty hadn't been random entertainment. It had been the manifestation of decades-old trauma, projected onto David as a convenient target. The realization didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained the particular viciousness of his gift. He's upstairs now, Jessica continued, in the surgical waiting area. He's been there since yesterday, just sitting and staring at the wall. I think seeing Mr. Thompson so close to death has triggered something in him, maybe memories of watching his father waste away. At that moment, David coded. The cardiac monitors in his room began their urgent alarm, and Margaret found herself running toward the ICU with a speed that defied her 72 years. Ranger bounded beside her, his claws clicking on the polished hospital floors as they raced toward the sound of crisis. They arrived to find medical staff performing CPR, David's body jerking with each compression. Richard Sterling stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale as parchment as he watched the life-and-death struggle playing out before him, a scene that must have echoed his own father's final moments with devastating clarity. The cardiac monitor's steady beep felt like a miracle after the chaos of the resuscitation. David's eyes fluttered open just as the sun began to set through the hospital room windows, casting long shadows across the sterile, white walls. The first thing he saw was Ranger's familiar face, the dog somehow having positioned himself at the exact angle where David's limited vision could find him immediately upon waking. "Hey, boy," David whispered, his voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. Ranger's tail moved slightly, not a full wag, but acknowledgement that his vigil had been rewarded. The dog's eyes held a depth of relief that seemed almost human, as if he understood how close they'd both come to losing everything. Margaret materialized beside the bed, her face showing the strain of 48 sleepless hours. "Welcome back," she said softly, adjusting his blanket with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades caring for others. "You gave us quite a scare." "How long?" David asked, each word an effort. 3 days since the surgery. You coded twice. The second time we thought—" Margaret's voice broke slightly. "The doctor said your body was just too weak. The cancer, the malnutrition, the stress. But Ranger never left. Even when security tried to remove him, he found ways back to this room. I think he knew you needed him to anchor you to this world." Movement in the doorway caught David's attention. A man in an expensive suit stood there awkwardly, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like vulnerability. Richard Sterling stepped into the room with the hesitant movements of someone entering sacred ground. "Mr. Thompson," Richard said quietly, "I owe you an explanation, and an apology that's long overdue." David studied Richard's face, noting the red-rimmed eyes and drawn features that suggested his own sleepless nights. "You paid for the surgery," David said. "It wasn't a question. It was the least I could do after what I put you through." Richard approached the bed slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "But that's not why I'm here. I need to tell you something about why I gave you Ranger because it wasn't what you think. It was worse. Margaret moved protectively closer to David's bed, but David raised a weak hand to stop her. I'm listening. Richard closed his eyes, gathering courage for a confession that had been building for 3 decades. My father was a Vietnam veteran, Robert Sterling. He came home broken. PTSD, alcoholism, rage that filled our house like poison gas. He beat my mother, terrorized me and my sister, destroyed everything good in our lives. When I was 15, he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. The room fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of medical equipment. David's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested understanding. For 30 years, I convinced myself that veterans were weak, that they chose their demons instead of fighting them. When I saw you under that bridge, homeless and struggling, you became the perfect target for all the anger I'd carried about my father's failures. Richard's voice cracked. I gave you Ranger hoping you'd fail, hoping you'd prove that veterans like my father deserved their fate. But I didn't fail, David said quietly. No, you didn't. You did something my father never managed to do. You found a way to heal, to care for someone else despite your own pain. You became the man I wanted him to be but never believed was possible. Richard wiped his eyes, not caring about the display of emotion. Watching you with Ranger, seeing the bond you built, it forced me to confront a terrible truth. My father wasn't weak. He was suffering, and instead of helping him, I judged him. Instead of loving him through his darkest moments, I resented him for not being stronger. Margaret had moved to stand beside Richard, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The gesture surprised everyone, including herself, but somehow felt right. The night you coded, Richard continued, I stood in that hallway watching the doctors fight to save your life, and all I could think about was my father's final moments. How alone he must have felt, how desperate, how convinced that death was better than continuing to burden the people who were supposed to love him. Richard looked directly at David. I realized that by trying to destroy you, I was completing the same cruelty I'd shown my father. I was proving that some people are disposable, that suffering makes you worthless. David was quiet for a long moment, his breathing steady despite the emotional weight of Richard's confession. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced death and chosen life. Your father was sick, Richard. Not weak, sick. The war damaged something in his brain that he didn't know how to fix. The drinking, the anger, even the violence. Those were symptoms, not choices. David shifted slightly in bed, wincing with pain. I've been where your father was. The place where living hurt so much that dying seems like mercy. If I hadn't found Ranger, if Margaret hadn't shown up with food and kindness, I might have made the same choice he did. But you didn't, Richard said. Because I got lucky. I found reasons to keep fighting. This dog who needed me, a woman who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself, and eventually, a chance to be useful again. David looked at Ranger, who had moved closer to the bed during the conversation. Your father didn't get lucky. That's not his fault, and it's not yours. The revelation that followed changed everything. Doctor. As Rodriguez entered the room with test results that defied medical expectations, the aggressive chemotherapy protocol, combined with David's improved nutritional status and reduced stress levels, had produced remarkable results. The cancer markers in his blood had dropped dramatically, and new imaging showed significant shrinkage in the remaining tumors. I've never seen a response this rapid or comprehensive, Dr. Rodriguez admitted, reviewing the charts with obvious amazement. Something has fundamentally changed in your body's ability to fight this disease. I can't explain it medically, but the data doesn't lie. Margaret smiled through her tears, understanding what the doctor couldn't quantify. David had found reasons to live that were stronger than his reasons to die. Love, for Ranger, from Margaret, and surprisingly the opportunity to help Richard heal from his own wounds, had become a medicine more powerful than any chemotherapy. Richard stepped forward, his voice stronger now. "Mr. Thompson, David, I want to establish a foundation in your name, a place where veterans struggling with PTSD and homelessness can find the kind of support you never had access to. Ranger would be the first therapy dog in a program designed to pair service animals with veterans who need them." "Why would you do that?" David asked. "Because I need to honor my father's memory by helping people like him instead of punishing them for struggles they didn't choose, and because you and Ranger showed me that healing is possible even for the most broken among us." Jessica appeared in the doorway, having driven straight from Stanford when she heard about her father's breakdown and David's recovery. She carried a small wrapped package which she placed on David's bedside table. "This was my grandfather's," she said, unwrapping a Purple Heart medal that caught the light streaming through the window. "Dad told me the whole story. Grandpa Robert earned this in Vietnam, but Dad never understood its significance until now. He wants you to have it, not because you need validation of your service, but because it represents our family's commitment to finally honoring the sacrifice that veterans make." David accepted the medal with trembling hands, understanding that he was receiving more than medal and ribbon. He was being given the responsibility to help heal a family's generational trauma. Outside the hospital window, Austin's skyline stretched toward the horizon. But for the first time in years, the view didn't represent the distance between the powerful and the powerless. Instead, it showcased a city where unlikely connections could transform cruelty into compassion, where a homeless veteran and a billionaire's guilt could combine to create something beautiful and lasting. Ranger settled onto the hospital bed beside David, finally allowing himself to relax after days of anxious vigilance. The dog's presence seemed to calm everyone in the room, a living reminder that sometimes the most profound healing happens not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of refusing to abandon someone who needs you. 6 months later, the Austin Veterans Healing Center stood as a testament to the transformative power of second chances. The facility, built on a 20-acre plot of land that Richard had purchased and donated, combined state-of-the-art medical facilities with a working ranch where veterans could find peace among horses, dogs, and open sky. The centerpiece was a bronze statue of a German shepherd sitting loyally beside a soldier's boots, a tribute to Ranger and all the service animals who'd given their loyalty without question. David Thompson, his hair now showing more gray, but his eyes bright with purpose, stood in the center's main courtyard watching a group of homeless veterans work with rescue dogs in the morning sunshine. His cancer remained in remission, a medical miracle that Dr. Rodriguez continued to study with fascination. The combination of advanced treatment, proper nutrition, and what she privately called the healing power of having something to live for had given David not just years, but quality years filled with meaning. "Captain Thompson," called out Maria Santos, a young Iraq veteran whose PTSD had left her unable to hold steady employment. She approached with a golden retriever mix named Buddy, who'd been found abandoned in a Houston parking lot. Buddy responded to the stay command for a full minute today. "I think he's ready for the next phase of training." David smiled, watching the interaction between Maria and her canine partner. The center's innovative program paired rescue animals with veterans, creating bonds that healed both species. Veterans found purpose in training and caring for dogs who'd been abandoned or abused, while the animals received the patient, understanding care that only someone who'd experienced trauma could provide. "That's excellent progress," David replied, kneeling to greet Buddy properly. The dog approached with the cautious optimism of an animal learning to trust again. "Remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's connection. You're teaching each other that consistency and kindness can overcome past hurt." Margaret Whitman emerged from the center's main building carrying a clipboard and wearing a volunteer coordinator badge that she claimed made her feel important again. At 73, she'd found new energy in helping run the daily operations of the facility. Her nursing background proved invaluable in coordinating medical care, but more importantly, her maternal instincts provided the emotional foundation that helped veterans feel safe enough to begin healing. "David, you have visitors," she announced with a knowing smile. "The Sterling family is here for the dedication ceremony." Through the facility's main entrance came Richard Sterling, transformed from the arrogant billionaire who'd once used human suffering as entertainment. His daughter Jessica walked beside him, now a junior at Stanford studying social work, her path influenced by witnessing her father's transformation. Behind them came someone David hadn't expected to see, Richard's ex-wife, Catherine, and her new husband, both of whom had driven from Dallas to participate in the ceremony. "We wanted to be here today," Catherine explained when David expressed surprise at her presence. "What Richard did to you was unforgivable, but what you did for our family, helping him find his way back to being human, that deserves recognition." The dedication ceremony drew nearly 500 people, including local politicians, fellow veterans, and families whose lives had been touched by the center's work. The mayor presented David with a key to the city, while the governor announced that the Austin model would be replicated across Texas with state funding. But the moment that brought David to tears came when Ranger, now officially certified as a therapy dog, led a parade of 23 other service animals and their veteran partners across the courtyard. The dog's transformation from a damaged, useless animal to the cornerstone of a healing program represented everything the center stood for. The belief that no one is beyond redemption, that love and patience can overcome the deepest wounds. Richard stepped to the podium for the ceremony's final speech, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with an authority born not of wealth, but of hard-won wisdom. "A year ago, I thought I understood the world," he began. "I believed that success meant accumulating more than others, that strength meant never showing weakness, and that some people deserved to suffer for their failures. I was wrong about everything that mattered." He gestured toward David, who stood beside Ranger near the bronze statue. "This man taught me that true strength lies in continuing to care for others when you have every reason to give up. That real success is measured not in what you accumulate, but in what you give away, and that love, for family, for animals, for strangers who need help, is the only currency that actually creates wealth." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a plaque that read, "The David Thompson Veterans Healing Center, where second chances become new beginnings." Below it, in smaller text, was a quote that had become the facility's unofficial motto: "Sometimes the most broken among us carry the greatest capacity for healing others." As the crowd dispersed, David found himself alone with Ranger in the courtyard where their journey had led them. The dog, now graying around the muzzle but still alert and protective, pressed against David's legs in the gesture of companionship that had sustained them both through their darkest hours. "We did it, boy," David whispered, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "We turned the worst thing that happened to us into the best thing we could do for others." Above them, the Texas sky stretched endlessly blue, and for the first time since Sarah and Emma had died, David Thompson felt truly at peace. He had found his way home, not to a place, but to a purpose. And beside him, a dog who'd been deemed worthless had proven that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the cruelest jokes. In the distance, Richard Sterling watched the scene through his office window, finally understanding what his father might have become with the right support, and grateful beyond words that he'd been given the chance to honor that possibility through David's courage and Ranger's unwavering loyalty. Sometimes life delivers its greatest gifts wrapped in our deepest pain. David Thompson lost everything: his wife to cancer, his daughter to tragedy, his home to grief. Richard Sterling had everything money could buy, but lived empty, consumed by 30-year-old wounds from his veteran father's suicide. Both men were drowning in different oceans of loss, until an act of cruelty became an unexpected bridge to healing. What started as a billionaire's cruel joke, giving a worthless dog to a homeless veteran, transformed into a story of redemption that saved 3 lives and created a legacy of hope. David found purpose in his pain. Richard discovered that wealth without compassion is poverty, and Ranger proved that love recognizes no boundaries of species or circumstance. Their journey reminds us that our hardest chapters often become the foundation for our greatest contributions. At 55, 65, or beyond, it's never too late to write a new ending. Your experiences, both triumphant and heartbreaking, aren't just your story. They're someone else's roadmap to hope. The Austin Veterans Healing Center stands today because 3 broken souls refuse to stay broken. What broken piece of your life could become someone else's miracle? Share your thoughts. What unexpected blessing emerged from your most difficult season? Have you ever discovered that helping others healed your own wounds?